and Yali Madat. My name is Sarah Juma, and I will be the moderator for today's Critical Conversation. The Critical Conversation series has been conceived as an ITREB USA initiative aimed at engaging the entire Jamaat, but with the focus mainly on 18 to 40-year-olds. The series aims to explore critical questions of our time within the context of faith. Before I begin, I'd like to read a land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards and original stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous people and their traditional territories. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and a way of honoring the Indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from the time immemorial. It is important to understand the long existing history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or in a historical context. Colonialism is currently an ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness and our present participation. We would like to open our session today by acknowledging that the land I reside on is the occupied and unceded seized territory of the Muskogee Creek people and the Cherokee peoples of the Atlanta area. These tribes have stewarded the land throughout the generations, and we would like to pay our respects to elders, both past and present, as well as current members. We believe that the work we do in sessions like these are part of our ongoing responsibility to acknowledge ongoing harm that has been done to Indigenous people on these lands and work towards a society that is more just, equitable, and in keeping with our ethics as a Smiley Muslim. With that, I'd like to introduce our topic today, 20 years after 9/11, exploring narratives, geopolitics, and repercussions. Today's session will provide an opportunity for us to explore the multiple narratives around 9/11 and the impact on Muslims in America and on Muslim communities around the world. During this session, you will also see a Q&A box through which you can share additional questions or through which thoughts can be shared during the presentation. We will try to address as many questions submitted during today's talk as we can. With that, let me introduce our wonderful scholar, Dr. Dhanani. Dr. Alnoor Dhanani is a specialist in the intellectual history of Muslim civilizations with a focus on historical and contemporary interactions between science, religion, and philosophy. He has taught at Tufts, Harvard, Brandeis, and Brown universities, as well as the Institute of Smiley Studies and the Institute of Muslim Civilizations. He was the head of the Department of Graduate Studies at the Institution of Smiley Studies and was instrumental in setting up the STEP program to train teachers for the IIS secondary curriculum that endeavors to teach Islam to Muslim young adults from the rich perspective of the humanities. At the outset, we would like to note that the views of our speaker expressed during the course of this discussion is his own. Let us then turn to our conversation. As we begin, we also want to acknowledge the lives that were lost and everyone impacted 20 years ago in the terrible tragedy that happened in New York City on September 11th, 2001. We would like to take a moment of silence for a Fatiha to pray for everyone affected by this event. All right, Dr. Dhanani, I'd love to start asking questions. Let's go and just jump into it. One question that arises during tragedies often is, do you remember where you were when it happened? And while you answer that, I would love it if we could open that question up to the audience and hear what they have to say about where they were when 9/11 occurred. Please, Dr. Dhanani.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So let me offer, give my thanks to the organizers who set this conversation up. It was just yesterday that the entire nation participated in the 20th observation of 9/11. And this is also a very, very important event and for the American Muslim community, for the Ismaili Jamaat worldwide, So I'm glad we're having this conversation, and I hope that our participants will find it useful. So where was I on 9/11? So I remember, I used to have to drive to work, and on my drive, I was crossing into a town called Belmont, and I'm listening to NPR, and it says, "Well, it looks like a small plane or something happened at the World Trade Center." So this is live news that's happening, and they were still not sure what was going on. And by the time I almost reached work, the second plane had hit, and by that time it was very clear that this was not a small plane, it was not a fire, it was something very major. And then all of us around work congregated and saw what was happening. So that's in a sense what it was. And if we look at the slide that I have, you can see that the most people are around the age of 30. If we can go to the next slide. Really remember where they were, because it is one of these events that is so powerful enough that people actually, like I said, I knew exactly where I was and what I was doing. I had to basically run back home, pick up the kids from school because school got canceled. That particular year, my daughter was in elementary school. My son was I think he was entering high school, and he was a tour guide on the battle green of Lexington, which is where the American Revolution is normally described as happening at first. And he was asked by Fox, is he really an American and a Muslim? And he basically had to say that, no, he's actually born here. He's not from somewhere else. So you can see already within a few days, this issue of being American and Muslim was being picked upon. So that's where I was with my children. My wife actually was in Korog in Tajikistan. And when she came back, she was actually asked to describe a little bit about her work in Tajikistan. So if we can go to the next slide, you can see this is a write-up of her in the Boston Globe in October. And what she talked about, I think the quotation at the beginning is very important, is that, they found out that Ahmad Shah Massoud had been killed on December 9th. They knew something terrible was going to happen, which is, and they actually were watching things on TV, and it looked like a movie to them. Mm-hmm. And since she was part of the AKDN kind of presence in Korog, there was actually arrangements to transport them all out. And when they were transported out, she noticed that there were MiGs on both sides of the plane that transported them out, because as you may know, Korog is right on the border between Tajikistan and Afghanistan. So that's where my wife was. So, for all of us, it was really something that we remember, and we were in different places. So that's what I have to share about this event.
I'd love to also share a couple of stories that have come through in the chat. And the first one is from someone who said, 9/11 marked my first day of work at JP Morgan on Wall Street. We started at 8 a.m. with the training for the global class of analysts, and there were no outside news feeds. So a little after 9 a.m., we were told that a plane had, quote, landed on the World Trade Center. Not knowing much more, we were dismissed and told we would reconvene the next day. When we exited the building 30 to 45 minutes later, we saw burnt paper and ash littering the floor. Not fully realizing the magnitude of what had happened and unaware that a second plane had crashed into the other tower, a few of us jumped on the subway. We passed by the World Trade stop, which I presume was right before the first tower collapsed. The train got stuck in the tunnel, as we were told by the conductors to proceed first to the back of train and then to the front. The subway had begun to fill up with smoke. We were finally able to platform one door of one car at the next station. which let out on Broadway in direct view of the second tower, which was still standing at the time. Many of us just stood on the avenue along with the throngs of other people, just watching in horror, seeing what we thought at the time was debris falling from the tower. We saw beams starting to sway and buckle, and a simultaneous realization dawned across many people that we needed to run. It was several blocks before we felt safe enough to walk again, and by this time we were covered in ash and soot and utterly confused as to what this all meant. The news we were getting was from cars that were parked along the avenue with their doors open and radios blasting the news from that morning. I walked with a few of my newfound colleagues, some who had come in from places as far as Australia, to my parents' restaurant on Chelsea, which was the only place I could think about going. The cell/telephone lines were out / busy, so we walked into the store. This was the first my parents saw or heard from me. Wow, I think that is a extremely, extremely powerful story right there. I can't imagine what it was like to actually be in New York at the time.
One of the things that showed up in the Detroit press on the discussion of 9/11 and what people remember is a story for which I have a slide, but it's interesting that for Arab Americans, that day is one of fear, is where, once they realize what had happened, it's a day where their fears got realized. And we have to also acknowledge that not only was there destruction, but it was also, in a sense of foreboding of who was responsible and what the consequences were going to be.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think we can deny that. Actually, that brings me into the next question that I would like to discuss, which when we talk about the events that occurred on September 11th, 20 years ago, it didn't happen in a vacuum, and we now know that there was a lot of context behind this event. Would it be possible for you to take us through the geopolitics that led to 9/11?
Yes, so, this is a huge topic, and I want to kind of break it down into different pieces. So actually what I'd like to do is to skip a slide, but get to the next, one more slide. Okay. So in a way, this is how I kind of thought about it. Is 1979 is a very important year. We'll talk about this, but this is the year of the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union, which creates refugees, and we'll talk about this. So this is a Cold War context, and so the U.S. and its allies get together and try to devise a plan to remove the Soviets out of Afghanistan. And here you end up with a kind of mix of people and consequences that are still with us today, which is they kind of define this as a jihad. So we have what I call the Mujahideen. And the Mujahideen makes this into a worldwide recruit for people who want to engage in jihad, and that this is what, through a group called the Afghan Arabs, ends up with AlQaeda, later ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, so forth. And Afghanistan itself, once the Soviets are basically they have to withdraw because they're not able to maintain their occupation. There's a civil war, and that ends up with the Taliban coming to power, and then we end up with the refuge for Osama bin Laden, who plans 9/11. So that's the kind of large story here. And let me go through like the bits of it in detail. So if you can switch to the next slide here, you can see that I talked about 1979. And 1979 is when 4 major things happen that are, important for Islamism. The idea that the government and society should be governed by quote unquote Sharia as defined by people who hold themselves to be guardians of what this is. Now, just from a historical point of view, Muslim civilizations have always had this, kind of acknowledgement that they are people who are experts on the Sharia or fiqh, but in a sense, the actual rulership or governance has been in the hands of others who, in a way, were able to negotiate to what degree they give credence to the people who consider themselves experts. So the history of Muslim governance is much, much more interesting and not as kind of portrayed idealistically as by proponents today of Islamism. So in February, we have a revolution in Tehran. Now the Shah, who was a pro-US kind of leader, is overthrown, and you have, nominally, and much, much more so later, an anti-American Shia Islamist government. In Pakistan at the same time, the military ruler Zia al-Haq basically agrees to the demand of making Pakistan more Muslim or Islamic, and he basically decrees, not legislatively, but through the fact that he's a military ruler, punishments that are punishments for adultery and so forth that are defined so-called supposedly in the Quranic way according to fiqh. Then in November, almost the end of the year, there is a seizure of the Grand Mosque in Mecca, which is a very interesting thing because people who took it basically didn't think that the Saudis were Muslim enough. So this put the Saudis actually ended up getting outside support, probably French, to kind of remove these militants. The outcome of that was to minimize their kind of standing. They decided to become much, much more conservative than they already were. And then to cap it all off in December, we had the Soviet invasion. So if we switch to the next slide, then we can talk a little bit further now. So the invasion, as I mentioned, creates refugees, and you end up with 3 million refugees in Iran, 3 million in Pakistan, some in India. And for us, this is the beginning of also the fact that we have Ismaili refugees from Afghanistan in Pakistan now, which means that our institutions have to now deal with, issues about rituals being different between the Central Asian tradition and the South Asian traditions, also how to deal with refugees, how to deal with schooling, all of the kinds of issues that would come about that today are dealt with by organizations as focus and so forth. So this is in a way the impact right at the beginning that takes time and in a way solidifies into refugee communities and the kind of political issues that refugee communities are going to have. We'll go to the next slide, please. So as I also mentioned that, as part of the Cold War, now there's a condemnation immediately by the Security Council, by the Organization of Islamic Conference of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And on the other side, the Mujahideen, the idea of a jihad to get rid of the Soviets in Afghanistan is set up. And the CIA is part of it. The ISI, which is the Pakistani Inter-Services Agency, intelligence agency, is in a way a conduit for providing funding and arms. And also it is in a way it has Pakistan's own interests, or in a way defines what Pakistan's interests ought to be. Then we have the rich nations in the Gulf, the Saudis and others, who provide funding. And the funding actually, from the numbers I saw, was about $500 million a year. Half of it so by the US, and it was matched dollar for dollar by the Gulf nations or the Saudis. Not just that, but then there was also private donations. And private donations is, in a way, when Osama bin Laden starts out, he starts out by actually becoming a person who has, he belongs to a wealthy family in Saudi Arabia with contacts with the royal family there. They're involved in construction, and he has really good contacts, and he becomes a conduit for funding for the groups that are fighting in the Soviets that have camps in Pakistan, that have great influence through the refugee camps, and then they obviously are trekking their arms over into Afghanistan. So this is a meeting at the White House, and I don't know if there was any clue then of what the consequences would be. It is really something that was not well thought of. Can you go to the next slide? And this is a picture of ISI leader whose name is Hamid Gul, who is kind of the second person from the right, and the CIA in 1987, which is almost towards the end. The war would come to an end in 1988-89 when the Soviets would withdraw. So we have ample documentation of this kind of cooperation between the CIA and ISI. Next slide. So this is what Hamid Gul says. He says, we are fighting a jihad. This is the first Islamic international brigade in the modern era. The communists have their international brigades. The West has NATO. Why can't the Muslims unite and form a common front? And this seems like, okay, we're going to have our own Muslim NATO, but the Muslim NATO is not controlled by nation states. It's basically these kind of groups that are finding jihad that, in a way come together, and they have no kind of national accountability, so to speak. And so that now it also means that Pakistani ISI has a great deal of control. Now, why is Pakistan so involved in this? So, this goes back into the issue of, the kind of fear that from the Cold War, the Afghans basically had, links with India. India was in the kind of orbit, or at least more sympathetic to the Soviet Union. Pakistan was more sympathetic to the US. So Pakistan thought that, if Afghanistan on one side and India on the other side, are kind of in cahoots, then they are stuck in the middle. And so they had an interest in playing a role into getting an Afghanistan that was more sympathetic to Pakistan's own positions. And that way, you can see both there, we have global Cold War, but also local politics that play a role in what's going on. Can we have the next slide, please? So the Mujahideen that enter into Afghanistan come from all across the world. This becomes a global or a worldwide jihad. And you have this group which is called the Arab Afghans. I mentioned to you that the fundraising is taking place in Arab lands. Not only that, but it's actually even taking place in the US. So this particular person, Abdullah Azam, a very important person who actually recruits Osama bin Laden to come to Afghanistan. He used to come yearly to the US to raise funds at college campuses, in California, in New York, in the southern parts of the state, of the country. So, you can see that in that sense, there was a pretty much allowance for them to come, and they would rile up the people who attended mosques. So you can see when you think about the radicalization of Muslims, in a sense, this jihad movement ended up providing, opening the door for the ideology that they had into the mosques of the United States. The CIA provided the Mujahideen with anti-tank and anti-helicopter missiles, so that kind of blunted the advantage the Soviet Union had, and they basically were stuck in a guerrilla war with the terrain, which was very difficult, and they basically were forced to withdraw in 1989. So can we go to the next slide? So around this time, and seeing that they had been successful, Azam, bin Laden, and other Arab Afghans established AlQaeda. Now, in the end, there were probably not more than 3,000 Arab Afghans, as part of the battle in Afghanistan, but they had much larger goals. And obviously they had Egypt on their mind, so Zawahiri, who became, or still is, the kind of leader of Al-Qaeda, but who at that time became the second in command to bin Laden, basically was part of a movement called Islamic Jihad in Egypt. So they were thinking of how do we take our learning into Muslim lands. And you can see their goal is the establishment of Islamic rule and the restoration of the Islamic Caliphate. So that's their idea, is basically to no longer have this kind of nationalist governments, liberal, secular, authoritarian, but not Islamic governments in Muslim lands, but rather to have a caliphate. Now, Azam was killed in 1989, probably by either bin Laden or by Zawahiri. The accounts are not clear about that. And that removes him, and you can see now bin Laden and al-Zawahiri become the principal leaders. Now, Al-Qaeda becomes implicated, in many different acts, but from our point of view, in 1998, they bombed the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi and in Dar es Salaam, and the USS Cole in 2000. So you can see that they're quite active in pursuing what they want to pursue. Can we have the next slide, please? And so in order to justify what they're doing, they issued a fatwa. Now, fatwas are issued by people who have legitimate credentials, but they did it on their own, so they don't necessarily have the credentials of having studied fiqh or being part of a fiqh organization in a nation state. But they issued this fatwa that said to kill Americans, civilians and military is an individual duty for every Muslim in any country. So you can see this kind of idea of global jihad, and of course it's put in the language of, it's about Palestine and it's about, foreigners in Saudi Arabia. So this becomes a very important aspect of how they define themselves. Can we have the next slide? And then 3 months later, there is an interview with ABC where bin Laden repeats the same thing. And you can see at the end, he says, we believe that the worst thieves in the world today and the worst terrorists are Americans. So very clearly it was already there. So I want you to keep this in mind, because there are many people who say that no, this could not have been the work of Muslims. But you can see clearly in 1998, there's enough documentary evidence that the idea of targeting Americans was already there. Can we move to the next slide? Okay, so I just want to say that, as I mentioned to you, that with the withdrawal of the Soviet Union, the Afghani warlords, Mujahideen, fought amongst themselves. This gave rise to the Taliban. The Taliban had very kind of their views of, again, the caliphate, of Sharia, are very extreme. So there were these Buddhas in Bamiyan, where part of the Ismaili community had resided for many decades. The Buddhas in Bamiyan were destroyed in 2001 before 9/11 happens. Next. Okay, so this is where I tried to point out to you the kind of global geopolitics behind 9/11. Sarah?
Yes, thank you for that. I really appreciate it. I know it was a lot. Might have been a lot of information for some people, but maybe if we go into a little bit more detail and talk about the narratives. There's a lot of contested narratives around the events of September 11th. And there are a lot of conspiracy theories and, fighting about who's actually responsible. Could you briefly touch on these narratives that still resound today?
Yes. So, if the first narrative that I'd like to start with is political. So, if we can move to the next slide, as you know, that our former president. Oh, by the way, this is an implication of 9/11. We all have to go through this kind of TSA checks at the airport today. So I'm going to start off with contested narratives. So if we just move to the next slide, we can. What I'm covering here is taking care of the next slide. So one of it is that Muslims basically did not apologize. They celebrated in the thousands, and this is the narrative that Trump took. And you can see that he was interviewed in 2015 before he went for president. And even though he's told that the police said this did not happen, he insisted on it. And later on, even Giuliani, who was a big supporter, but before he took Trump's kind of became the lawyer and supporter, he actually also agreed, and he was mayor at that time in New York, that this didn't happen. Now, what I want to do is to look at the next slide, and the next slide is important because one of the accusations is that Muslims didn't condemn 9/11, that, in a way they supported, as you saw that in the kind of implied that they were celebrating on 9/11. So this is an important aspect that sometimes is not looked at, is when we think of American Islam, the earliest Muslims, in a sense, are the African Americans. They came here as slaves, and they tried to recover being Muslim at the beginning of the 20th century in what was called the Nation of Islam. And as you can see in the kind of picture that I have in that circle, you have the founder of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, and at the bottom, the person who is balding is his son, Didnt, and next to him is Louis Farrakhan. Louis Farrakhan continued the ideas of Elijah Muhammad, but Muhammad actually moved further and made the kind of Islam that practiced closer to Sunni Islam. But in any case, you can see right after 9/11, on the 14th, the Friday that followed, Didnt gave a khutbah at the masjid. And he says, the US flag, all glory is new glory for me now. This is my flag, and I see what it stands for. I will fight and die for. So you can see very clearly this notion that we are American. This is our country. We were attacked. You can see, says these terrorists were not looking for guilty people. They were just looking for people, American citizens, targeting places where they could send a big signal. Any one of us could have been there. There's a strong possibility that someone for our community died in one of those attacks, explosions. Then there is no justification ever for killing or mistreating innocent persons, never. But, it's a very, very strong statement. And thinking about this statement about someone from our community, if we go to the next slide, we actually have somebody from, before I get there, Bush was at the Islamic Center on September 17th. He also had talked to Didnt Muhammad. And so the president was kind of, and you can see from the remarks on the next slide, was much more unwilling to accuse Muslims as a whole as to be the responsible for this. Now, these are remarks that were just made yesterday, where he sees that what happened between violent extremists abroad and violent extremists at home, both of them disdain pluralism, disregard human life. So he basically paints both the proponents of 9/11 and the proponents of January 6th in the same kind of light. And he talks about that, at the time when religious bigotry might have flown freely, I saw Americans reject prejudice and embrace people of Muslim faith. That is the nation I know. And then he talks about, again, the nation should be welcoming to immigrants and refugees. So it's a very interesting perspective that he brings, and he was responsible. But having said that, there were certain things that happened when he was president that are obviously problematic. So if we go to the next slide, you can see, as I mentioned, somebody from our community was affected. His name was Sulaiman Ali Qasim Ali Dhanani. This is his name on the 9/11 memorial in New York. And I want to read through this. You can, I'll give you, or at least I'll let the organizers know about these slides that you're seeing, and they can make available to you so that you can read in detail. But this was an Ismaili who was actually killed on 9/11. Next. And Louis Farrakhan makes the same kind of remarks. What is very interesting is he calls them so-called human beings. He doesn't even want to call the people who were the 9/11, people who flew the planes and caused the crashes, human beings. He calls them so-called human beings. And he talks about the Quran and the idea of justice. So it's very interesting. Again, this is 9/16. So the Muslims were right there in a way to condemn what was going on. Next slide, please. And these are, in Tehran, there were candlelight vigils. Yasser Arafat in Palestine condemned it. Most Palestinian organizations, or all that I know, condemned them. There was a march in Bangladesh. There was a march in Michigan, in Dearborn. That is a huge Arab population. You can see again Palestine at the Islamic Center in LA. So there was a lot of condemnations right away by Muslims about what had happened on 9/11. Next. And this is a group of scholars who teach Islam in different capacities. They came out and were against it. Next. And then this is, talking about that even Friedman, who writes for the New York Times, didn't look at what was in his own newspaper. He said to this day, no major Muslim cleric or religious body has ever issued a fatwa condemning Osama bin Laden. This was in 2001, but there was already a huge advertisement on October 17th that kind of condemned it. And there were condemnations by Al-Azhar, by the Iranian Ayatollah Khashoggi. There was even condemnation by Hamas and Hezbollah in 2005. And, Edward Said, who has talked about Islam Orientalism, basically talks about a long history against Islam and Muslims. But, I don't think that the people who are contemporary Islamophobes actually even think about that long history. There's just a gut reaction that they have, and anti-Muslim reaction, which is not even well put together as it is sometimes in Orientalism. Next. Okay, so having done that, let me just very briefly say something about conspiracy theories. So there are many conspiracy theories. There's actually a Wikipedia page on this. One of them says the Muslims could not have done it. It was too well done. So therefore, it must have been the CIA or Mossad, because I presume the Muslims are not intelligent enough to do it. So that's the kind of way it is portrayed. And if you look at, there's this new book out. It's called The Looming Tower. It's a long book. You can actually borrow it through archive.org, which is on our resources page. And you can see, when people have looked at all the material that has become available, and as I mentioned to you, the interviews that bin Laden gave, this was in the works. So you either have to ignore all of that evidence, or if you accept it, then this position is hard to sustain. There's a position that the Jews were told not to go to work on that day, or that this was really not brought down by planes, but it was a planned demolition by placing explosives. So this conspiracy theories continue. As we see on the next slide, you can see that, how many people believe there was a conspiracy theory, and you can see at least 23 people strongly believe or somewhat believe, 15% have no opinion, and strongly disbelieve is at 45. This is in the US. If we go to the next slide, and you can see that in the Muslim world, in Jordan, for example, 39% of people interviewed in 2006 believed that the Arabs carried out, and actually it declined. So you can see that there are quite large populations who don't believe that 9/11 was carried out by the Arabs. And certainly in Afghanistan, most people today, according to the accounts that I've read, don't even know that 9/11 happened. So that's a very, very disturbing statistic that exists. And then on the other side, you can see the notion of suicide bombing. Is it justified or not? Okay, can we go to the next slide? Okay, so let me just stop here, and Sarah, give it back to you.
Thank you. So yes, before we move on, thank you for addressing all of that. And I'd love to next touch on what happened directly after 9/11. And so along with these conspiracy theories, there were many stereotypes about Islam and Muslims that were kind of expanded upon. These stereotypes existed before 9/11. However, after 9/11, we begin to see an intensification of Islamophobia. Could you give us some examples of these repercussions of on the American Muslim community?
Yes, so Islamophobia is in a way not new to America. It's been there before. So obviously there's a long history to Islamophobia, as I show on the next slide, and this is not the time to really go into it in detail. So if we can look at the next slide, let's see here. Just go back one. Yeah. So there's a long history of polemics, from the Middle Ages and so forth, and also Christianity not viewing Prophet Muhammad as a prophet, and so forth. And at that time, where the Ottoman Empire was strong, so it has to be seen in a political context, some of this religious polemic. But the contemporary manifestation of this actually occurs in 1992, that kind of expanded in 1993 and 1996 in Samuel Huntington's book called The Clash of Civilizations, which is basically saying that the clash with the Soviet Union is over now. The Soviet Union has fallen. Now our clash is going to be with basically, Islamic civilization, because it is so different than we are. And this was challenged by Edward Said in 1993. But it gets taken over, Islamophobia, even before Huntington, by the evangelical Christian community. It's because, there are certain aspects that are very, the notion that your salvation is not going to be through Jesus. Only Muslims believe that, there is the Prophet Muhammad after Jesus is considered to be very threatening to evangelical Christianity. And there's also this notion, much more so in the last couple of decades, of the kind of political alliance between Zionism and evangelical Christianity, because of the way the evangelical Christianity sees the idea of rapture and the last day. So you can see here this image of this person wearing a t-shirt that says Allah is Satan, and that every real Muslim is a jihadist. And that's part of this increasing Islamophobia that's taking place. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that this connection now with 9/11, it tells you all you need to know about Muslims. So this is in the US. You can see it from the US flags. Next slide. This is the Islamic Center of Detroit, where, the Detroit in Dearborn has had one of the oldest Arab Muslim communities. And they've been there since Ford started the Model T. So there's a very long Arab presence, but there they're being told to go home. And really the question of immigrants in the US, if you came from Italy or from Ireland, or certainly are a Jewish immigrant, you may actually have come later than the Arab Muslims did to Detroit. But there you can see how that is being portrayed in their graffiti. Next. And these are, again, basically statistics. Islam is not part of mainstream society, but there's also an acknowledgement that the coverage of media about Muslims is not fair. Next. And here is kind of a political breakdown, that more Republicans have kind of views that Islam is violent than Democrats do. The fact that Islamophobic events have increased over time. And then there's also this kind of counter view in 2015 that is basically saying, well, maybe additional scrutiny of Muslims is not warranted, but 32% actually think so, and 7% didn't answer. So that's pretty big also. Next. This is Islamophobia in the UK. And the next one is Islamophobia in Australia. So it became worldwide. And I think one of the things that we have is the sharing of information through cable news or social media. Is, things are no longer, these kinds of attitudes are no longer restricted to one place geographically, but they spread, and conspiracy theories spread, as well as kind of Islamophobic or other phobic reactions spread very easily. Next. This is another example of this person wanted to build a mosque in New Jersey. They paid for the land, and they were given all kinds of excuses as to why they couldn't build it through zoning and so forth. And this was story in the New York Times. And the next one is about this ground zero masjid, so-called. And you can see here too, the people who supported this position or were against this mosque It was called the Cordoba Project, not even a mosque. I know the person who was going to be running it and his wife. They're very Sufi inclined. But they were said that, oh, this is going to be on ground zero, even though it wasn't really on ground zero and so forth. And what is interesting is the Anti-Defamation League, which is a Jewish organization, which at that point was against the Park 51 mosque, has now come out and said we were wrong to have supported this position. So they have realized that it was an Islamophobic position to take. So that was really that project did not go through. Next. And you can see here, in a way, the opposition to the mosque, is equal to the pro-mosque, and there's a large group of people who will remain neutral about this. So basically, that's in a way some of the consequence in the U.S., particularly with regards to Islamophobia, that arose. Sarah?
Thank you. Yeah, I think especially what stood out to me was the slide you showed on unfair representation in the media. And it made me think of how a lot of media now has kind of come out in the last 20 years, and some of it, how it's changed. We had our homeland representations, which have been repeatedly pointed to as being very problematic. But now we have our shows like Rami, which also has received criticism, but is a different perspective and definitely a more inclusive perspective. So I do wonder how, if we were to take some of those surveys today, how the conversation has changed. But I would like to also, where you left off, jump into that and talk about how this has been a global conversation. It is an American event, but it has triggered many global conflicts that are still impacting us today. And I'd like to ask, how has the global Muslim community been impacted?
Sure. So let me just say that I think, to your point about the kind of new portrayals in TV shows and so forth. But it seems to me that we are so divided now that we kind of stick to what we would like to hear or see. And that's really a shame, that in a way, the kind of shows that show Muslims in a different light, even in terms of comedy also, they are seen by people who are already kind of sympathetic with that position. And so we have a huge issue here of how do you engage in education or changing of views when people are somewhat stuck in their silos. But coming to the repercussions of 9/11 in a global sense, I think it's very clear, as the next slide will show, that, let's just move on here. And you can see that's this is again the kind of Patriot Act that comes out, and we move on from here. We immediately had this a notion of we have to catch them, and we have the invasion of Afghanistan that occurs. But in a sense, already Afghanistan is not considered by politicians to be the real culprit, but somehow Iraq gets dragged into this. So there's the idea of the axis of evil, Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan. And the situation in Afghanistan is never, in a sense, closed and resolved before there's this idea that, Saddam Hussein was also sympathetic with Al-Qaeda. Now he's amassing weapons of mass destruction. What if it gets into the hands of Al-Qaeda? And there's a notion that, probably rightly so, that Al-Qaeda was interested in chemical weapons and so forth. So there is this whole rev up, but the U.S. tries to get international agreement on it, but it fails to do so. So that without the Security Council approving, the U.S. invades Iraq, while the Security Council had actually supported the invasion of Afghanistan. Now, the point was that no WMD was found. So this whole notion of the US intelligence and what it knows and how it knows, basically collapsed. There is really, can we trust what the US intelligence says with its satellite pictures and so forth? And then in order to kind of get further information, basically all kinds of what were then called enhanced interrogation techniques, which is torture, which was used. And since the US law forbade it, basically this torture was then outside the US in what are called black sites in countries with kind of authoritarian regimes that were kind of, allies of the US by getting US arms and so forth. So this is where this torture took place, so that the US could say, well, they couldn't be dragged into American courts. The government couldn't be, So they also established Guantanamo, which still exists, which is where prisoners are held and where now the trial of is supposed to begin of the 9/11 mastermind in a couple of weeks. But there too, as we shall see, these guys were held in really very bad conditions, open air cages, so to, until it was kind of all pressure improved. And we now know that most of the people who were taken to Guantanamo were innocent, and they ended up there for 15 years or so until they were, set free under the control of their own countries and so forth. Then there was, in a way, the infamous prison Abu Ghraib in Iraq, where again there was torture. There were all kinds of pictures taken of nude prisoners in really disgusting poses. And this kind of notion that the American army is an army that's a professional army, respects international law, human rights, was completely disgraced by what come about. So in these wars, and in a sense of the larger kind of battle of trying to control extremism, the US was not able to end up with stable governments, and the battle of what's called hearts and minds was lost. It became a battle of just using pure force. And the people around George Bush, the defense secretary or the vice president, really basically wanted to have might is right kind of an attitude rather than the one that basically tried to find a way of changing hearts and minds and really getting the culprits who were actually responsible. So they ended up being further wars in Syria and Yemen, which are proxy wars between Saudi and Iran through support from the US, let's say. And that too also in a way has led to, a global decline in prestige of the United States and its influence. And that's continuing. And in a sense, you can see Obama tries to say, okay, I'm going to get it back. Then Trump basically says, no, it doesn't matter. We're great. And you can see Biden trying to do it again. So in a sense, this plays into the domestic politics that we have. Sarah?
Just a quick question before we move on. I have a follow-up question for you, but I was wondering before we get into that, could you define proxy war for our audience members?
Yes, proxy war is basically, so when we have the battle in Syria or Yemen, it's kind of portrayed as though it's a civil war in Syria or civil war in Yemen. But in a sense, the different parties there are serving the interests of Iran or the Saudis. So the Saudis and the Iranians are not directly there, but they're fighting through their proxies, through their local kind of supporters. So that's what a proxy war is.
Thank you, Dr. Dhanani. All right, so I'd like to follow up to what you were just talking about and kind of want to focus on this idea of the geopolitics in Muslim countries. It's constantly shifting, and like everything that you've talked about, it's still fluid, it's continuing to change. And so my question is, what impact does this then have on national boundaries, which have been kind of set by past colonial powers?
So in a sense that, the boundaries in the Middle East are really post of the First World War, 1920s or so. The boundary between Afghanistan and Pakistan is a British boundary that's disputed. And the boundary between India and Pakistan through Kashmir is disputed. So all of these states were not nation states. The nation state model is as Benedict Anderson has pointed out, it's an imagined community. It's not a community that is in a way, intrinsic, so to speak. For various reasons, they have been unstable, partially because of how those forces are played by external, dissension or internal dissension. So those are there. And the idea of a caliphate is that, we don't need nation states. We're Muslims, we can live all together happily, which Muslims actually haven't historically. And historically, actually, there's never really been a caliphate that went from Morocco all the way to, let's say, at that time it would be the borders of China. Spain, Andalusia was never part of it. What about Indonesia? What about West Africa? So these are all kind of idealistic notions that really don't exist. But the point being that if you are a pan-Islamist who actually believe in a caliphate, you want to say there shouldn't be any boundaries, and these are colonial impositions. Now we know, for example, from the way Yugoslavia exploded, that the boundaries that we have, nationalism can exacerbate kind of differences, which is why I think the Imam has placed such a big emphasis on pluralism. Pluralism means that we have differences, but we learn to live together, which we actually kind of worked hard at when we were not nationalistic. When we became nationalistic, we thought, oh, well, we don't care about our neighbors. They can do their own thing. We do our own thing, even doing our own thing was problematic because we all ourselves are never homogeneous as we claim to be. So, in the sense, shifting boundaries is a historical phenomenon. It occurs, but nationalism, I think, puts a new twist to it. And the question becomes, what happens? Let's say with Syria, if the de facto division actually holds, then do you have economically viable communities? Do you have communities that are pluralistic, that respects the rights of minorities? So you can see that pluralism and the values that it embeds are much, much more, in a way, the kind of values you want for a state. Let's not call it a nation state, because it allows for that state to, in a way, develop, to thrive, to support, and so forth. While nationalism seems narrowly with boundaries being redrawn, or in a way looking at minorities as somehow not full citizens, it is really not the way we would want to think of people being able to live together in peace.
Absolutely. So as a global Smiley community then, we know that there's repercussions for our community from at that time and even now, especially being a religious minority in many of these countries. Could you share how our community was impacted a bit?
Yeah, so one of the repercussions to think about, we talked about domestic politics and global politics, but the repercussion for the Afghani Jamaat is there too. And as I mentioned to you, that a large portion ended up as refugees in Pakistan, some in New Delhi, in India. And with the fall of the Taliban, there was an encouraging movement through funding, through Acadian investment to have these communities return back to Afghanistan. So if we can switch to the next slide, let's see if that's the right one. By the way, this is Abu Ghraib and so forth. Let's, and going to Guantanamo. And then this is the Pompeo with the leader of the Taliban trying to basically, coming up with this deal that the US had to withdraw. Next slide, please. And then here you can see that the Afghanis, the Taliban are eating mithai or sweetmeats when they're able to get control of their major towns in Pakistan. This is in Quetta, in Afghanistan. Sorry. Next slide. So I think that should be, yeah. Let's go to the next slide. So here you can see that, as I mentioned, AKDN invested since 2001, and inset in this picture is Jamaat Khana. So in Kabul now, there are at least 5 Ismaili Jamaat Khanas. And so you can see that there was a lot of building in terms of Ismaili institutions. There was the establishment of the councils, ITREB, so forth, on religious education. There were plans, I don't know whether they got materialized, of having step teachers trained. The curriculum that we use worldwide for the Ismailis to become part of the teaching of Afghani Ismailis. And then engaging in civil society, building the Serena, engagement in health, education, communication, so that the major cell phone provider, Roshan, is AKDN associated initiative. So this is how the community came together. Now, and so I think they were looking forward to, in a sense, being able to continue their path. And obviously, with the Taliban now in power, they're going to have to think about how do they renegotiate, how do they recalibrate. So it has created a lot of anxiety for the community. All I know is that, at least as of last week, most of the Jamaat in Afghanistan was safe. Now that's a relative term, but at the same time, you may wonder whether Ismaili women have the same ease of access that they used to have to go to school or to teach or to go to Jamaat Khana. And I think you can be mindful that, safety is an issue. How do you think about those things? And then, there's also a large Afghani diaspora community. So we have Afghanis in the US and Canada. And you can see that what that has happened is thinking about rituals that were specific to the Central Asian Jamaat or the South Asian Jamaat, where the Jamaats now come together in the Western diaspora. There needs to be accommodation, thinking about how do we come and practice together, and how do we, in a way, have leadership and communities, in terms of volunteers and so forth, that we integrate both of the Central Asian members of the Jamaat, the South Asian members of the Jamaat, and also the Arab members of the Jamaat. So, so we, in a sense, what happens in Afghanistan or Syria is not just there, but because of global patterns of migration, it leads us to rethink who we are as a community and how do we practice, and how do we also make sure that we get along. And these are challenges that the leadership faces. And I think, we, generally speaking, Montreal is a very good example of where the communities have come together exceedingly well. So that's what I think, I can say about how it has affected the Ismaili community, not just with regards to Afghanistan, but refugees from elsewhere.
Thank you. And thinking about this and the impact, I know for many of our younger Jamaati members, it can feel very distanced, right? I think a lot of people were born in 2001 or after, and we now have a whole generation of young people who are distanced from 9/11 and who don't have the personal connection with the events that happened in necessarily the same way that you or I do, but live in a transformed world. And this transformed world has subtle but deep-seated bias against Muslims. It's changed, right, from what we knew. And so what are some of the ways that young people growing up in this world can begin to see the biases and the differences, and how can they begin to address it?
So I think to see the biases and differences means that you need just to have open eyes, and you can see how Muslims are treated and how non-Muslims are treated. And I would hope that, don't end up in a silo where you're not open to reading about it, understanding about it, participating in conversations about it. So that just, means that, you are open to being able to understand your situation, analyzing it. And by the way, the kind of inequity is not just about Muslims. There's inequity that extends across other communities. So that, in that sense, to be able to understand your own equity, you should be able to understand other inequities. And which is why I think it's, to me, it is very heartening to see young Ismailis, involved in issues of social justice and equity. So, I've actually not worried about that aspect of, whether they know it through the kind of detailed work of Islamophobia or not. They understand issues of inequity. And yeah, we can enhance their understanding there with regards to these other aspects. But I think the other part of what you're raising is, how do we counter Islamophobia? And I mean, you're not going to do that by quoting verses of the Quran or the Bible and so forth. I think what you need to do is to normalize being Muslim. And now what do I mean by that? At one point, there was a great deal of anti-Semitism here. So the Jews were considered to be second-class citizens, and they had to find their way, they had to build their way, they had to form a narrative. And they didn't try to make the Christians into Jews, just like so they basically talked about their, achievement in world history, their engagement in the arts and the humanities and the sciences, i.e. that they were engaged as human beings, in all activities that human beings do, and in a way to make the world better for everybody, and also in a way the enterprise of human beings in terms of literature and so forth is to understand the idea of values, their idea of thinking about different emotional characteristics of human beings, the whole span of things of what makes us human. And there's this entire span of Muslim engagement too. There's Muslim literature, there's Muslim art, there's Muslim contributions to the science today and in the past. And this is where I think we are very woefully ignorant. And this is what the Imam has called the civilizational history. It's not understanding ourselves only in theological terms. We understand ourselves as participating in the human enterprise, in the human story. And the human story is a story of civilization as humans. Now, even as Muslims, we rarely know about the poetry of the past. Even as South Asian Muslims, how many people know what Ghraib said or what contemporary poets say? So in that sense, I think we have to be much stronger in being able to relate to our tradition. And it is in those aspects that you can find communality, between, Western, let's say, poetry or music or appreciation of values or the arts or engagement in human endeavors, as you can with, Muslims or Chinese or whatever. That's the common thread of being human. That's what I mean by saying that we need to normalize ourselves. We normalize ourselves to civilization.
Thank you. Thank you for that last really big point and message. I'd like to move towards the Q&A session and, open it up, have members of the audience kind of submit questions into the chat if they get a chance, or into the Q&A box. And would like to give it a second for for some questions to come through. Sorry, go ahead.
So Sarah, I mean, you are interested as an art historian. What can you tell us about some of the ways in which post 9/11 artists have engaged with these kinds of things?
I think it's very complex, honestly. I think that there has been a lot of conversation. There's been a lot of art that has kind of come out post 9/11. And I think we can see I lived in Philly for a very long time. And I think one of the galleries that I used to go to a lot, called 12 Gates, we can see that there's been a history of exhibits there on American Peril and on I think there was an exhibit, We Got Used to the New Us, which talks about counter-terrorist narratives and like the artist's reaction to them as being the people who were kind of targeted by this. There's been a rise in media specifically targeted, especially to Muslim audiences or people who have that interest. Ajam media, there's, Muslim Girl magazine. There's also been a lot of literature. There's been books. I remember probably in 2001, 2002, probably 2002, there was a book that came out called What Does It Mean to Be a Problem? And it was a series of essays by Arab Americans who then, talked about their experiences. And there was Mahmoud Mamdani's Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. There's a whole rise of taqwa music, which is a subgenre of punk. So there's been a lot of media, music, literature, all sorts of things that have come out. And to me, I wonder if these artists would still be doing this kind of art or this specific work, which I feel is kind of reactive and providing a counter narrative. If 9/11 hadn't happened, what would Muslim representation in media and art be today? And how much of the work that's being created right now is a direct response to 9/11? I think all of these questions come up when I consider that.
So it just ties in with the question that you asked me about, how do we make young people aware? And I think in a way, making them participate both as readers and also creators is a very important aspect, because I think that then they own the narrative, they participate in the narrative and they own it. And I think, in a sense, I talk as a historian, but if you want to think about contemporary engagement, then the scene that you described becomes very important to find ways to engage with.
I agree. I 100% agree. And if any audience members would like to do more research or would like to hear more about, some of these things that have come out, different art, different platforms, would love to share that in the chat with the audience. I would also like to get into some of the questions that are coming in. One of the questions that have come in is, what is your forecast on relationship between Islam and the West and the relationship of media and mainstream opinions? And I think this kind of ties in well with what we were just talking about when it comes in with art and kind of creating the narrative. So I'd love to.
So this idea of Islam and the West, I think, are in a way categories. And as initially you could think of that as geographical categories. But at this point, the geography doesn't matter, because there's so many Muslims in the West, and some of them have been here for a long time. So the idea of thinking about the West as purely Western without Muslim presence is, I think, again, is an imagined construct. It doesn't, it cannot have weight on its own. And the question becomes, how do we participate actively into saying that, there is such a thing as a Western Muslim? Basically, by that we mean that any Muslim is contextual, is localized, understanding of Islam is not the same everywhere that you are, because local contexts play a great role. So South Asian Islam is not the same as Southeast Asian Islam. There may be similarities, but there are differences. And the question that has been discussed is, what is Western Islam, or let's say British Islam or Canadian Islam, going to look like? And obviously that, and I think as younger generations who no longer have their parents' positions from the diaspora, they engage with this with an open perspective. And really, and you're exactly right, is people who are creative engage with the construction of new narratives. People who, what's interesting is that people who joined AlQaeda, were mostly from engineering or the kind of science background. They were not from the humanities background. because they saw things in really rigid black and white terms. So we need to have openings to people who are creative, who can think in new ways, who can be Muslim and Western at the same time, and see no dichotomy between them. Now, they have to do the work to remove the other side of the divide, which is people who think Muslims can never be Western. So that's the work that needs to be done. But to me, I think that having this diaspora is no longer a diaspora at this point. We have Americans who are Muslims, and some of them have been here for centuries. Some of them have been here for longer than most immigrant communities have. So they need to be able to use the voice to normalize themselves, and to refuse to accept the narrative in which they are placed, which sees a dichotomy between them as Muslims and others as Western. They need to break that boundary down.
I couldn't agree more with that. Another question that has kind of come in, and I think is very timely and relevant, especially to our conversation, but to what's happening today and right now, is how can we help the Afghan refugees who are coming to the United States today?
So I think there's multiple organizations that are dealing with this, and I think that, as you know, that through iCivic, there are attempts to gather supplies and so forth. I think at this point, we need to think about their resettlement. At one point, there are people who are coming to settle in the United States. How do we help their resettlement? So that has many organizations that are involved, and you need to make sure that you find an organization that is above board, that does a good job, that has experience in this. And I would hope that at some point we're able to institutionally provide avenues for people to find the correct ways of supporting this. On the other side, there is thinking about what happens to people who are left in Afghanistan. Right? How do we, in a way, think of ameliorating the situation that they find themselves in? And this is going to be very unpleasant, because it means that you may have to bite the bullet, accept the fact that the Taliban are in power, but find ways of negotiating how to make slim opportunity possible for the people who are left there, with the hope that over time these will get bigger, and Afghanistan will have gone through the phase that it is now in. The worst thing that can happen is another civil war and more of this AlQaeda and ISIS and so forth. So, for that we need to be politically engaged, so that the right kind of policies are thought of by the governments that we are part of. So I think there's a two-pronged engagement that is to keep. But I also think that what we talked about before is how do we think about Islam in a civilizational way, so that the narrative of seeing either Afghans as newcomers, new immigrants to the US, or those people who are, still in Afghanistan, as human beings, as how do we think about their normative needs? How do we think about their development over time? How do we think about, the women, economics, health, education? These are important things to keep in mind locally and also in the future in Afghanistan.
Thank you. A last question that we'll touch on before we wrap up, as we're coming to a close, is just it's a question that talks about the lack of awareness about contemporary Muslim societies and their history prior to 9/11, and how it has kind of led to the inability of the US population to fail to distinguish between geopolitical agendas that are just being wrapped or packaged in religious ideologies. And so the question is, in the last 2 decades, did the Muslim diaspora in the US make any meaningful impact to fill that vacuum at a local level, such as cities, towns, and neighborhoods? This person says that personally it feels like Muslims have become more bubbled in silos as they were at the time at local levels. And then also has a question, has there been a national level attempts to bring Muslims in the spotlight? And has it had a trickle down effect? Or to bring, good Muslims or positive media into the spotlight, and has it had a trickle down effect?
This is a tough issue because the media is so siloed here, and that people are stuck in their narratives. To be able to move past narratives is I think a difficult struggle. We should call it a jihad. This is the meaning of jihad, actually is struggle. So we need to kind of engage with this struggle. And the way we do that, I think, is really to show that we have the same concerns as our neighbors who may not be Muslim. So that requires engagement. And that, in a way, it requires doing more than your neighbor has to do. Because, you have to show that you are not the person that your neighbor thinks you are. So there is an additional burden in that sense. So I think initially you have to think on the smaller level, which is a personal level, a family level, your own town level. But there is a larger political level. And the larger political level means that you choose your political stances carefully. You choose who are the people you're going to support carefully. That you need to think about not just your economic self-interest, but where you have to think about what is the self-interest of your own family over the long term. What is the self-interest of your children growing up safely? So those are things you kind of realize that you need to be mindful of how you do that. And of course, the political system is not perfect. That's a very, very long road. But at the end of the day, you have to go down that road. And that road for the African Americans who have had the vote since the 1960s, but have still to meet some of their aims. You can see that it takes a long time to go on that road. But we have allies. Who are our allies? How do we work with them? And those are things to kind of keep in mind. And I think we need to be mindful of how do we put good stories in the media that kind of break stereotypes. Not because they're breaking stereotypes, but because those are good stories. So that's something that we need to be mindful of how do we make Muslims normal in the media and in other narratives.
Thank you, Dr. Dhanani. And thank you so much for today and for taking the time to speak to us. And I'd also like to thank you, the audience, for joining us today. Hopefully this has been just the start of our quote, critical conversation. It was such a treat for me, and I hope it was for those all who are watching. Once again, I would like to thank everyone here. I'll also be putting some links in the chat for additional resources before we go. And if you would like to, I know we had some questions come in about the recording. If you would like to see the recording of this conversation, or if you would like to see past conversations, please visit Facets of the Faith on the Smiley.USA. I would also like to announce that if you are looking on the Smiley.USA, the Smiley USA webpage and social media, we have young adult conversations this week, and that have been announced, and our next critical conversation has been announced as well on there. And we have a session as well at the end of this that will be on your pop-out screen as you leave. If you could please take the survey at the end of the session, we would greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, you everyone.